So welcome everyone for coming. I'm glad to see you back, or those who are new. Welcome to this series on how to practice Buddhist ethics in everyday life. Let's begin by just taking a moment to create a sacred space or a teaching ground. So wherever we may be, in our office, our bedroom, the kitchen table, living room, looking at a laptop or a phone or whatever it may be, let's just in our mind recognize that for the next 90 minutes or so, we're engaging in a Dharma conversation, a Dharma exploration. And because of that, we want to be in a sacred space, whether you visualize a temple or a teaching ground or even a classroom, whatever works for your mind, to put your mind and body into a space of being receptive to receiving teachings and not a mind mixed with all the worldly thoughts that spur us on most of the day. This is a really, I do this when I talk about this when we do online teachings, just because it's easy to be distracted when you're not in a teaching ground. But this kind of practice of re-envisioning your environment is very common. And if you do almost any many pujas or tantric practices in the beginning, you have what's called purifying the place. And when you purify the place, you imagine yourself in a Buddha field, usually, if you're doing a tantric practice where you're visualizing a specific deity. So you visualize that you are in that ground. So whatever coarse environment you're in fades away, and you exist in the realm of this Buddha for the period of that practice. So being able to recognize that there's a sacred nature to all environments, and to bring that sacred nature forward through your visualization and practice to make your mind more powerful and your practice more powerful is a very common thing we do. So here we're not doing it on a tantric level. We're just trying to help keep our minds focused and in the right, in the right level of receptivity to engage in Dharma. So take a moment to do that. Be comfortable in your body, relaxed. Whatever activities you're doing before joining us this evening, you can put those aside. Don't let them intrude into your mind. They'll be waiting for you, whether you want them to be or not. So you can put them aside for now. And as we do that, let's make a strong motivation that we've come together today to discuss and explore the teachings of the Buddha, to improve our minds, to move us closer on the path of Buddhahood. And we do that not for our own sake alone, but for the sake of all sentient beings. So even though the immediate benefits of this practice, this study, will be for ourselves, the goal is to become a Buddha so that we might be able to benefit all beings, have the greatest capacity to help others. And so with that long view, having the attitude that takes that long view in mind, we've come together to do this practice. So really set that strong intention. I'm here today to improve my mind, not for my own benefit alone, but for the benefit of all sentient beings, so that I might develop the resources and knowledge and skills that allow me to be of maximum benefit to other sentient beings. And we'll just recite a quick verse of refuge and bodhicitta 3 times to help secure our motivation. In the Buddha's Dharma and Sangha, until enlightened I seek refuge, through merit from giving and the rest. To aid all may I become Buddha in the Buddha's Dharma and Sangha. Until enlightened I seek refuge, through merit from giving and the rest. To aid all may I become Buddha in the Buddha's Dharma and Sangha. Until enlightened I seek refuge, through merit from giving and the rest. To aid all may I become Buddha. Great. Thank you so much. So this is the third in our series of how to practice the essence of the Buddha Dharma in our everyday life. The first one, we explored karma. The second one, we explored bodhicitta. Today, we're exploring Buddhist ethical precepts. I have to say, teaching online again, I had taken a break from online teaching. And I recently, before this course started, I taught in Bodh Gaya, a 6-day course. And teaching to an audience in front of you versus teaching to a computer screen is wildly different. And so I'm still readjusting to what it's like to teach online. So I apologize if there's some, it feels a little bit robotic sometimes when I don't have interaction with students. So, and it makes it harder to study as well, right? As a student, not to be in the presence of the person you're talking with can be a little difficult. So I appreciate us coming together and relearning what this is, this kind of teaching practice together. So our goal, right, of practice, our goal is to practice the entire path all of the time, right? So every Dharma topic we should have infused into our body and mind, and that everything we do should be an act of Dharma. So we don't want to pick and choose and say, well, today I'm going to practice compassion. Oh, tomorrow I'm going to practice following the 10 non-virtues, and so on. When you start picking and choosing, then our judgmental minds and our self-cherishing minds have an opening to kind of get in the way and to control what we do, right? So we want to practice the whole path all the time, every topic. And eventually this will be effortless, right? Eventually, as we continue to study and practice, we continue to meditate on the topics and make them of one nature with our mind, then we don't have to think about these different topics, right? Because what we're doing by studying and meditating and practicing is fundamentally changing our habits, our way of being in the world. Because up until now, we've been in the world, we've lived a life that has been motivated by our self-cherishing mind. It has been clouded over by our self-grasping minds that misunderstand the nature of reality. And so we've been living in samsara in such a way that we just perpetuate samsara for ourselves and for others. So the goal of our practice is to find happiness, to find perfect, complete bliss for ourselves and for all sentient beings, to be free from all suffering. That's the goal of our practice. And the way we do that is by taking these teachings, studying them, analyzing them, and then internalizing them. And by internalizing them, we practice them with every breath we take. We don't have to think about them anymore. So that's the goal, to transform our way of being from a worldly way of being to, we could say, a spiritual way of being, if we like. But that doesn't mean that we're sacrificing having fun, right? It doesn't mean we're sacrificing having a good time. What we're doing is understanding the nature of samsara and being honest about the nature of samsara. So then, because we're honest with ourselves about what it means to exist in samsara, when we experience moments of happiness or joy, we can embrace them wholeheartedly, and they become more robust, more fulfilling, because we don't grasp onto them as if they're permanent, right? We don't grasp onto them as if they are the only thing that gives our life meaning. We recognize them for what they are, the ripening of past positive karma, meeting the right conditions in this life, and we enjoy those experiences or sensations or whatever they may be, but we don't cling to them. And by not clinging to them, we aren't enslaved by them in that way. So giving up the worldly life doesn't mean giving up having a good time. It doesn't mean giving up enjoying things, whatever they may be, whether it's going to the movies, reading a good book, having a nice bowl of ice cream. Giving up samsara doesn't mean giving up enjoying and having a fun time. It means giving up your clinging to that as being the true source of happiness.
Buddha,
So the
Buddha,
truth is, though, as we, even though we're supposed to practice the whole path all the time, right now, there's so much information, right? There's so many different things we're being taught and we're trying to study. It's useful or skillful to focus on specific topics like we're doing. And so we might dedicate ourselves for, let's say, a week, focusing on one particular aspect of the path. And so we might meditate on that in the morning. And then during the day, we make a special effort to practice that particular part of the path. Because right now our minds are so all over the place and they're so unhabituated to practicing virtue that it does require effort on our part. And so that's okay. Eventually, it'll be effortless. Eventually, we can practice all parts of the path simultaneously. But until then, we work slowly to make all these Dharma topics of one nature with our mind. So, when we talked about bodhicitta last week, we think of bodhicitta as this universal motivation, right? This idea that everything we do not for our own sake, but for the benefit of other sentient beings. All of our practices, whether they be a spiritual practice explicitly or a worldly practice, even going to work or engaging with our family or whatever it may be, if we do them with the mindset that I am trying to improve my life, not for my own self, but to be of better service to others. Even if that means I'm going to work to earn money, not because I want a big bank account, but because I realize that in order to practice Dharma, I need to have material resources. And so this job has given me an opportunity to accumulate enough resources that I can practice Dharma more easily in this life, right? So we let bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, be this universal motivation. And when we can do that, it transforms all of our activities into virtuous activities, into beneficial activities. So bodhicitta is really powerful in that way, but it takes effort, right? Because we haven't lived our lives with the mind of bodhicitta. We're just learning about it now. We're just trying to create new habits that are focused on others instead of ourselves. So we might spend some time focusing on bodhicitta in the morning or whenever we do our meditation practice to focus on the different aspects of developing bodhicitta, the different processes, especially compassion and equanimity. And then during the day, we try specifically keeping those in mind, how to practice that one thing, you know? And so we work sequentially through the topics. It's the same with our study and our meditation practice as well. You know, we're often advised to meditate on the Lamrim. And if we look at all the Lamrim topics, many times the way we're advised to meditate on them, again, it differs from teacher to teacher and student to student, but it might be like, okay, you spend 1 month meditating only on the first topic, you know, on impermanence and death, or on guru devotion, perfect human rebirth, and so forth. Spend 1 whole month just meditating on that. And when you finish that, you move to the next topic. And when you finished all the topics, you start over again at the beginning because now your mind has changed. Your mind is transformed through your practice and your meditation. So when you start at the same topic you began with, you're looking at it freshly with a new mind, a more powerful mind. And so we're taught to practice sequentially so we become familiar with it, right? We always talk about the three aspects of study or of engaging in the Dharma of Tusam Gomsum. First we study or we listen to the topics, and then we analyze them or contemplate them, and then we meditate on them, right? We go through these 3 stages. And the meditation, the goal of that is to become so familiar with the topic that we no longer have to think about it, that it becomes of one nature with our mind. That's what it means to meditate on something, to become familiar with it. And so that's the process. Once we're familiar with it, it becomes second nature. We don't have to think about practicing it. So bodhicitta, as we talked about last week, is forward-looking. When we try to practice bodhicitta, especially employing the techniques of focusing on compassion, that all sentient beings don't want to suffer, and yet they are suffering, and therefore may they be free from all suffering. focusing on that and on equanimity, that the distinction between friend, enemy, and stranger are just superimpositions due to the circumstances of samsara, but not due to the nature of other sentient beings. Therefore, they all are equal in deserving my love and compassion, and they're equal in deserving to be free from suffering. When we use those to practice bodhicitta throughout our day, what that does is it's a forward-looking practice, right? It shows us what it means to look like a bodhisattva, and it moves our practice in a forward direction. Now, the week before, we studied karma, and karma is similar in that when we understand karma, it modifies the way we behave in the world to encourage us to only engage in virtue, to avoid the 10 non-virtuous activities, but it also lets us understand what's happening to us right now. So it lets us look backward in some way. It lets us understand when we experience difficult circumstances or when difficulties arrive in our life, we understand where they came from, right? And we don't fall under this idea that these are punishments that I'm receiving from the outside, or that these are some kind of external force happening to me, right? We recognize that our suffering comes from the result of our own past negative actions, combined with the circumstances we find ourselves in, so that they may ripen. And by understanding that, we can understand with a more clear mind how we are in the world. We can understand when we have suffering where it comes from, so we're not overwhelmed by that suffering, whether it be physical or emotional, whatever kind of suffering it may be. So karma helps us by looking in two directions. It helps us by looking backward, we understand what we're experiencing right now. And then by looking forward, similar to bodhicitta, it shows us how we have to live our lives so we might have happiness in the future, in this life and in future lives. So when we think about the ethical precepts, they again are helping us look forward. But they don't simply look forward, but they guide us towards a life of virtue. Right? That's the goal of precepts. So when we talk precepts, we're thinking specifically of different vows, right? Of the different levels of vows that we may hold. And the point of the vows is to align our activities all the time with a spiritual life. So what are the different kinds of precepts that there are, right? We generally say there are 3 different types of vows. There are what are called the vows of individual liberation, or the pratimoksha vows. Then there are the bodhisattva vows, and lastly the tantric vows. So we say there are 3 levels of vows. And so today we won't be talking about the tantric vows, but we'll talk a little bit about pratimoksha vows and about the bodhisattva vows. But if we think, what is the goal of all these vows, right? So the name itself tells us. So the pratimoksha vows, the vows of individual liberation, are the vows that, by following them, are guiding us directly towards liberation from suffering, right? They're showing us the pathway. In bodhisattva vows, by following the bodhisattva vows, they're showing us what it means to live life like a bodhisattva. When you're actually a bodhisattva, all the activities of the vows come naturally. They're not like something you have to think about. And the same with the vows of individual liberation. When you actually develop a strong practice and confidence in the Dharma, then you don't have to exert effort to practice the vows because it's your natural inclination due to practice. But in the beginning, we take the vows, and the vows are like, you know how sometimes if you go bowling and they put up railings in the gutters so that no matter how bad of a bowler you are, you can't get a gutter ball? The vows are like that, right? The vows are keeping us in lane so we achieve our destination, right? So the vows aren't taking away our opportunities for joy or happiness. They aren't taking away our opportunities to experience fun. What they're doing is guiding us and making sure we don't stray off of the path that's leading us towards Buddhahood. So any of the activities that would bring us away from Buddhahood, away from freedom from suffering, the vows prevent that if we follow them. If we think of the vows like a burden that we have to carry, or like a weight holding us down, then it's going to be very difficult to practice them, right? It's going to feel torturous. As a fully ordained monk, I have 253 vows. That's my level of pratimoksha vows. And if I think of those as, shackles holding me down, preventing me from having a good time, it would be impossible to keep all those vows. But if I think of those vows as they really are, which is to say, like the oars we use to guide and propel our boat across the ocean of samsara, then the vows become a useful tool. They become my lifeline, right? Whenever I have a doubt, the vows clarify it for me because they show me what it means to live a meaningful life, what it means to always be aiming towards liberation from suffering for myself and all sentient beings. I've known monks who became overwhelmed, especially monks, Western monks, and Tibetan monks as well. You ordain relatively young, in your 20s or something like this. And then I've known a Western monk who has since disrobed, and he just became overwhelmed with this thought that, like, I ordained so young, I think he was 24 or something. And he said, there's so much life that I never got to experience that all my old classmates are doing now. They're traveling the world, they're doing all these things. And so the vows have held me back. They've stopped me from doing what I really want to do. Once you have this attitude, the vows become a burden. And it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to hold vows. So, of course, that attitude leads towards giving up your vows because they become a burden. When you have the right attitude, recognizing that whatever vows we hold, these are our liberation, then so joyful to hold vows, It's one of my greatest accomplishments in this life is being able to hold the vows of a fully ordained monk and do my best to keep them purely. So wonderful, so incredibly rare. And so as lay people, you wouldn't have those vows, but you still have the pratimoksha vows if you take the lay vows. And it's so rare to have the opportunity to have these vows in your continuum. So it's so joyful to be able to practice them. Because what vows do, vows make our activity more powerful, right? They make our virtue stronger. As we were saying before, all of our activities of body, speech, and mind are preceded by a moment of mind. And so our vows actually, by vowing not to do something, for instance, not killing, having the vow not to kill and then not killing is a virtuous activity. Whereas if you don't have the vow not to kill, your lack of killing is a neutral activity. You're not actually accumulating virtue. But by having this disposition, I vow not to kill, I vow to preserve life, then your action becomes active. It takes what could normally be a passive activity and is neutral, is neither non-virtuous nor virtuous, and makes it virtuous because you have this mental activity saying, I will not kill. I will not bring about harm to other sentient beings. So in that way, the vows multiply our opportunities for merit. They say that the merit that a layperson can accumulate is like a drop of water compared to an ocean that a fully ordained monk or nun can accumulate due solely to the power of their vows. Yet at the same time, when you break a vow, the negative consequences are heavier because you've not only have you engaged in a negative action, but you engage in a negative action that you vowed not to engage in. So it's like 2 for 1, So the power of the vows kind of works in both directions. So when we take vows, it's not something we do lightly, whatever vows they are. Pratimoksha vows, Bodhisattva vows, tantric vows. We don't take them lightly, but we recognize that they're powerful and that they are able to lead us to liberation. So the vows, they're not actually types of minds. Some of the other Buddhist schools believe that. What we believe is that vows are a type of form, a very subtle type of form, that by taking the vows, it develops in our continuum. So it's not a mental action. It's a subtle form that coincides with mental activity. That's probably not too important for our purposes today, but it's good to know because some systems talk about vows as if they were simple mental actions. And if they're simple mental actions, then they can come and go quite quickly, right? And what it means to create a vow, generate a vow, then to break it, then repair it and generate it again over and over again, it becomes like a very, it's just a very simple act. Whereas vows have a little more heft to them than that. So most of the vows are proscriptive. They're telling us what behavior not to engage in. When we look at the tantric vows, there are some that are prescriptive. They say these are things that we actively should be doing, types of practice. But the majority of the vows are proscriptive. So they're saying this is harmful behavior. And so therefore, by vowing not to engage in this harmful behavior, you're aligning yourself with the activities of Buddha. So what kind of activities are they prescribing? That's the question. And some of them are what we call negative by nature. So the act of killing is always going to be negative. So I take a vow not to kill, but whether I take that vow or not, the act of killing creates negative karma. Because the act of killing or of causing harm is always negative. It's negative by nature. But then there are other vows where the object or the activity that we are abandoning is not negative by nature, but instead it is negative simply by decree. So what that means is, an example is with the lay vows, the vows of a householder. There are 5 vows of a householder, right? Of the 5 vows, the first 4 line up perfectly with the first 4 of the 10 non-virtuous activities. So restraining from killing, from stealing, from sexual misconduct, and from lying. Those are the first 4 vows that a layperson can hold, the vows of a householder. Then the 5th vow, the last of the 5 vows of a householder, is not to consume any intoxicants. I've been at teachings with His Holiness when he gave these vows in the West, and he said Westerners are so attached to their consumption of alcohol that maybe you just take a vow to only drink a half glass instead of a full glass. Because he recognizes that for some people, it can be difficult, right, to break their old habits. And so he tries to find that middle ground. But the vow itself is to not take any intoxicants at all. And so consuming intoxicants, though, isn't negative on its own. And the only reason it becomes negative is because we have a vow not to do it. So that's called negative by decree. And so with the lay vows, of the 5 lay vows, that's the only one that's negative by decree. For monks' vows, many others are negative by decree. And so why are we vowing not to do activities that aren't inherently negative? What's the purpose of a vow? And so the purpose of this vow, in order to understand it, we have to understand what is the vow trying to prevent or eliminate. We call it the gakja, the thing to be eliminated. So what is the vow trying to eliminate? So in the case of the first 4 lay vows, it's pretty simple, right? Not killing, not stealing, not engaging in sexual misconduct, not lying. The actions that those 4 vows forbid are negative by nature, so it's easy to understand. But then why do we abandon all intoxicants? If intoxicants themselves don't have a negative nature, they're neutral. And consuming them is neutral. And then we say, well, the reason that the Buddha instructed his disciples to not engage, to not consume intoxicants, is because even though the intoxicant itself and consuming intoxicants isn't negative, when you engage in activities that cause altered mental states, it becomes much easier to engage in other negative actions unintentionally, right? So there's the story of the Luchavi youth who took the vows, but he didn't take the vow not to drink intoxicants because he said he didn't think it was important, and that the first 4 vows were all he needed. And then he went and got drunk, and in his drunken stupor, he slept with another man's wife, so he broke sexual misconduct. And then he got in a fight and killed that man, so he engaged in killing. And he lied about his activities, so when he tried to hide from them and run away, so he engaged in lying. And I don't remember how, but he also engaged in the act of stealing as well. That's the way the story goes. So even though the vow of not taking intoxicants may seem like the most minor of them, by breaking it, it creates the opportunity or the open playing field to break all the others quite easily. So even though the act of consuming intoxicants is only negative by decree, there's a reason that we take that vow, right? We take that vow to help keep us on the path and to help keep our other vows even stronger and more pure, and to protect us from breaking them accidentally, to protect our minds. So whenever we think about vows, when we study them, we need to think not just what is this vow forbidding us from doing, but why? What is trying to be prevented through this vow? What action? And by doing that, we can develop some sort of level of confidence in the vows. If we don't have that confidence, then it can be very difficult to follow them. If we don't understand the reason why we have this vow, what's the purpose of it, then you don't feel any impetus to actually follow it, right? But when I think of the vows, on one hand, it's very easy to understand how to put the vows into practice. We can study them, we can learn what it is that they are preventing us from doing, and then we simply do our best not to do that thing. And then the flip side of that is we think of what are they encouraging us to do? What kind of behavior are they encouraging? So that level is quite easy. But when I think of what the big picture of what the vows are teaching us to do, is they're teaching us to live a life that is motivated by a mind of renunciation. They're helping us live a life that abandons the self-cherishing mind, abandons the 8 worldly dharmas, and instead embraces renunciation and uses renunciation as a way to engage in a happy and meaningful life. The 3 sets of vows have different levels of emphasis, right? The pratimoksha vows, like I said, are trying to show us what it means to be free from all suffering, to achieve liberation. The bodhisattva vows are showing us what it means to live like a bodhisattva, to engage in the natural behavior of a bodhisattva. And the tantric vows are similarly showing us the natural activities of someone who practices tantra, of someone who is engaging in this very subtle and profound level of meditation practice. So we can hold all 3 of these vows. They say that our pratimoksha vows are our outer behavior, and our bodhisattva vows constitute our inner behavior, and our tantric vows constitute our secret behavior. So we have all 3. The one that we display outwardly, the most important one, is the pratimoksha vows in that regard. But our inner behavior and our secret behavior are governed by the other sets of vows. So they all have slightly different understandings, right? Different levels of emphasis. But all of them are pointing towards living a life that is not attached to the joy of this life, living a life of renunciation, living a life that renounces samsara. So I think when we think about vows, it's useful to understand what we mean by renunciation, what we mean by a self-cherishing mind, and what we mean when we talk about the 8 worldly dharmas that we're trying to abandon. Because I think if we study the vows, we'll see that the overwhelming majority of them, by following the vows, they're automatically cutting off our self-cherishing mind. They're automatically cutting off opportunities for us to follow any of the 8 worldly dharmas. And they are encouraging us to live a life motivated by renunciation. So I think that's an important thing, a topic that we could talk about a little. So what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about some of the vows that we may have, and then we'll spend some more time at the end of class talking about renunciation and the 8 worldly dharmas and self-cherishing, because I think that's what the vows are getting at, right? The point of the vows is to adopt this mind of renunciation. And so we can understand that as being the goal of the vows. If we don't understand the goal of the vows, then even if we understand the individual vows, we don't have the big picture. We only have the little pieces. And when you have only the pieces, it's hard to use them in a meaningful way if you don't see what they're going to fit into, right? So first, let's talk about the pratimoksha vows briefly. There are 8 different sets of pratimoksha vows. So there's 2 sets for lay people, for householders, male and female householder. And then there is male and female novices, both monks and nuns. Then there's a set of vows for intermediate nuns. And then there's 2 sets of vows, one for fully ordained nuns, one for fully ordained monks. So that's 7. And then the last set of vows is called the one-day vows. And the one-day vows are parallel to what we call the Mahayana precepts. So some of you may have had the chance to take the Mahayana precepts, the 8 Mahayana precepts. It's a one-day practice. And the vows are the same, but the ceremony and practice of the Mahayana precepts actually comes from Kriya Tantra. It actually comes from a tantric lineage. So the emphasis and the motivation is different, but the vows are the same. So the vows themselves are the 8 vows that are one-day vows. And they're called that because you take them only for one day. Whereas the other vows, you take for the rest of your life. In the case of pratimoksha vows, you take them until you finish this life. Or for the Bodhisattva vows, you take them until you become a Buddha. So I thought we'd talk about the 8 Mahayana precepts, those 8 vows, first, and then maybe talk about some of the Bodhisattva vows. Because the 8 Mahayana precepts, the first 5 are common to the vows of a householder. And those are pretty straightforward. They're easy to understand, right? So when I vow not to kill, it's easy to understand how I can engage in that during the day, right? It doesn't need a lot of explanation. Same thing with stealing. Lying is a little more difficult to practice, but it's easy to understand, right? We find ourselves commonly in a situation where we think a small white lie might be okay. But that's a negative action of speech. It's always going to have some negative consequence. So a vow helps us remember that. So our understanding of the vows compounds our understanding of karma, right? They work together. And then not engaging in sexual misconduct, it's also easy to understand that and to apply it during the day, during our everyday life. So those, and then again, not taking intoxicants. If we understand the purpose of not taking intoxicants, of vowing not to, is to keep our mind free from extraneous delusions and free from altered mental states. And by doing so, allowing ourselves to be more clear with our practice of the Dharma, then that also makes sense, right? It's easy to understand. But then the next 3 vows that you take, when you take the one-day vows, the Mahayana precepts, those can be a little more difficult to understand, right? And so it's good to understand them because they can make the practice more powerful. So these vows are vows that monks and nuns already have in their continuum in one way or another. So on one hand, when you take the 8 Mahayana precepts, you are following in the footsteps of the ordained Sangha. And so that is a beneficial activity in itself. But so these additional 3 vows, the first one is to not eat any food at the inappropriate time, which generally means not to eat after midday. Then the next one is to not sit on high or expensive beds or thrones. And then the last one is to not engage in any singing or dancing or wear perfumes or jewelry or ornaments. So those are the final 3 vows of the 8-day vows. Of the 8 one-day vows. And so it's important to understand why we would take these and how that can change our practice during the day, how that can affect our everyday life. So when you say, well, why should I not eat food at an improper time? Why should I not eat after midday? We think back to why this vow was given and what was it trying to eliminate? So in the time of the Buddha, all the monks and nuns were begging for their food. And so if you ate one main meal, which was the meal you begged for, and then after that, you returned to wherever you were staying at the time, whether you were in retreat at a monastery or you were traveling and living on the road, and you engaged in meditation practice. And so by then taking a break in the evening to go beg for more food, you're doing two things. One, you're interrupting your meditation and your concentration. But two, and more importantly, you are putting a greater burden on the community of devotees who are giving you food, because you're now asking them to give double the amount of offerings. So you're creating an unfair expectation that can cause burden to those who are devoted to the teachings of the Buddha. And then lastly, you're also giving your own kind of greed and self-cherishing mind more opportunity to grasp on to things. The idea of having a nice, delicious, comfortable meal in the evening and a full belly like this, that's just another opportunity for your mind to grasp onto. So if we think that those are the things we're trying to eliminate, then we can see that even in our lives, when we're not begging for food every day, we can still look at those objects that are meant to be eliminated by this vow and then practice them. So firstly, we don't take meals at the wrong times because they interrupt our ability to practice. So instead, we use our free time to practice virtuous action, whether that be study, contemplation, meditation, or whatever other kind of virtuous action we may be doing. So we don't allow something like taking a meal to become a burden that makes our time less valuable, basically. And then we recognize that we don't want to be a burden on other sentient beings. Even those who are kind and caring and are happy to give to us in any way, we don't want to overtax them or ask too much of them. So part of not taking a meal at the wrong time, when you have that vow, you practice it by going out of your way not to take more than you need and not to create an undue burden for others, especially those who care for you and who would willingly give you everything they could. So it's not simply about eating a meal, it's about having a mindset that says, I'm going to use my time to practice the Dharma and not to interrupt my meditation or whatever practice of virtue I may be doing. I'm going to have a mind that doesn't put an undue burden on others and doesn't ask others to give more than they are comfortable or able to give. And I'm going to watch my self-cherishing mind and see if it's grasping after, a midnight snack because I'm actually malnourished and need food, or is it just because I find some sort of satisfaction, some worldly attachment to having that food? So it may seem like a simple and silly vow not to eat meals at the wrong time, but you have all these other pieces of it that are actually what your mind is doing or should be doing when you practice it. So you can take those into your everyday life when you take the one-day vows. And the nice thing about taking that vow, especially if you're not used to it, that you get a natural reminder of the vow in the afternoon when you start feeling hungry, and you have that your first habit is to grab something to eat. It's a kind of natural alarm clock that says, oh, that's right, I did take this vow today. Let me make sure I'm enacting it. I'm living it in a meaningful way, It's easy sometimes to forget the more common vows. Since I don't spend most of my time killing sentient beings, it's easy to forget that I have a vow not to kill sentient beings, right? But this one, if you're not used to it, your body reminds you. It says, hey, you're hungry. And then you take that as an opportunity to strengthen your resolve and your practice. I saw a great interview with Dalai Lama once. It must have been more than a decade ago. And it was a BBC interviewer. And he asked Dalai Lama, you've been a monk since you were 3 years old. So what is the most difficult part of being a monk and keeping all those vows? And you could tell, as most Westerners do, he expected some sort of answer relating to desire or sexual attachment, things like this. And Dalai Lama, he thought for a moment, and he said, as a monk, I'm not supposed to take a meal after midday. But when you have your afternoon tea, your first instinct is to reach for a biscuit. It's very hard to keep that vow. That's the most difficult vow to keep, which I thought was hilarious. And the interviewer clearly was not expecting that answer. So it was quite cheeky of Dalai Lama to give an answer like that. But so keeping this vow, which seems silly, right? Especially for lay people living in the modern world, you're not begging for food. You have access to it. Whatever food you need, you've already bought it. It's in your refrigerator, right? You can still keep the vow strongly with the mindset of, why am I doing this? What am I eliminating? I'm eliminating creating a burden on others. I am eliminating wasting my time with worldly activities and instead focusing my time on a spiritual practice, and I'm eliminating any opportunity or additional opportunities for my self-cherishing mind to guide my behavior, right? So even though the vow seems simple, it has a lot of things that go with it that we can incorporate into every part of our practice. And the same goes for the next one, not sitting on high or expensive beds or thrones. The purpose of that is to make sure we don't develop a sense of ego or pride. Make sure that we're trying to live a life that's simple and is not taking more than we need and is not putting ourselves above others, both figuratively and literally. So, we can say, well, I don't spend most of my time sitting on elaborate thrones, so it's an easy vow to keep. And in that regard, it is. But that's kind of a passive way of keeping it. The active way of keeping it is saying, what is the point of this vow? The point of the vow is to make sure that I never put myself above others. I don't think myself more important than others, more worthy than others. I don't give any opportunities for my pride to develop and for my pride to guide my behavior or influence my decisions. So when you think of the vow that way, then you understand there's an active thing you can do in the world. You're not just passively not sitting on a high throne or a high bed. And, sometimes, so for instance, when I was recently teaching in in Bodh Gaya, we took the 8 Mahayana precepts every day. And since I was teaching, I was sitting on a teaching throne that was above all the students. And so in my mind, I had to recognize that I'm sitting on this throne not because of me, but because what I'm doing here is sharing the Dharma. And the Dharma is what is being elevated, not me. I just happen to be the one communicating with others. But so as soon as I was able to think of that teaching throne as not being something about me, but as being something for the Dharma, then it was an acceptable activity to do. And so I wasn't breaking my vow by sitting on it. And in the same way, in your life, you may have to, if you run a team at your job or something, or you have people that work for you, you may have to put yourself above them in some way, whether physically or just literally, because you're in charge of something. And in order to complete a project, you have to exert that level of, I know what I'm doing. I'm in charge for these reasons, right? I have the knowledge and the wisdom and experience that allow me to be in charge. And I use that to complete a task in the most beneficial way. So you might have to do that, but you can do that in a way that doesn't break the vow. Because the vow is about having a mind that says, I am better than others and I deserve more than others. And others should shower me with, praise and adulation. So even though we take these vows, when we know what the purpose of the vow is, then we can think of the vow not as a passive action, but as an active opportunity to practice Dharma. And then the last vow of the 8 one-day precepts, or the 8 Mahayana precepts, is to abandon ornaments and perfume and singing and dancing. And this vow is about maintaining mindfulness, not engaging in worldly activities that distract you and cause your mind to become distracted and to veer away from the Dharma. So for those to be broken, they say, what's the mind that causes them to be broken? And that mind is actually a mind of, or the motivation is sometimes referred to as mindlessness, which is a strange motivation. But what it means is, if you're engaging in a Dharma practice, you can chant Dharma melodies at a puja or something. And, there are even singers who sing Dharma songs, whether in a worldly context or in a practice-oriented context, right? Those Dharma songs aren't the same as breaking this vow, because this vow is about engaging in mindless behavior, engaging in things that celebrate the worldly life, right? Wearing perfume and wearing ornaments is to celebrate the worldly life. And that's what we're trying to avoid. Engaging in singing and dancing, these kind of activities are celebrating this mindlessness, where you are grasping at these external things as if they're happiness and not thinking about the actual nature of reality. So we take this vow, not because we don't want to have a good time, but because we want our minds to stay focused on the Dharma and to live a mind of virtue, live a life of virtue that's infused with the Dharma mind all the time. So when we think of the vow in an active way like this, then we can see that it's beneficial and it's something we can incorporate into everything we do, Why am I not engaging in singing and dancing? It's because I don't want to allow my activities of body and speech to be guided by mindlessness. I want to be intentional. I want everything I do to be perfectly aligned with the Dharma. And when I become overwhelmed by these sensory experiences, then I'm not doing that. I'm letting my experience of samsara be the guide that pulls me around, like an ox with a ring in its nose. That's what happens when we engage in this mindless behavior. Is it possible to engage in dance and singing mindfully? Sure, it is. And we can make it a Dharma practice. But the point of this vow is to realize that overwhelming majority of the time, we engage in these mindless activities, not because we're searching for meaning, not because we're trying to help others, not because we're trying to calm our minds, but because we're trying to, we're running after the pleasures of samsara, right? That's what we're doing. We're allowing this kind of mindlessness to overwhelm us. So a vow like that is teaching us or reminding us that every moment we should be conscientious of what we're doing and why and how. So even those simple vows, the 5 vows of a layperson with the 3 additional vows added on for one-day precepts, you can see how to practice them in your everyday life. It's not this passive action of not killing, but it's actively going out of your way not to harm others. It's not this passive action of not stealing or not taking things that don't belong to you, but it's the active activity of going out of your way to preserve others' possessions and to not disabuse others of their possessions, whether they be physical or even mental or emotional, right? When we engage in a vow to abandon sexual misconduct, it's not the passive activity of not engaging in sexual misconduct, but it's recognizing that sexual misconduct causes harm to ourselves and to others. And so we're actively trying to cultivate experiences, even as a layperson, experiences that may be somewhat motivated by attachment or desire, yet still are not actively causing harm to others because we are celebrating other human beings and other sentient beings and wanting to only benefit them. We want to make offerings of them, not harm them. So by actively practicing the abandonment of sexual misconduct, what we're really doing is preserving the dignity and well-being of other sentient beings. So that's the active component. And you can do that even in obviously non-sexual environments, right? If you say the point of this vow is to preserve the dignity and well-being of other sentient beings, I can apply that practice to everything I do, not only sexual activity, right? So that one vow can actually revolutionize the way I treat other sentient beings, whether I ever viewed them as sexual partners or not. And the same with lying, it's not the passive activity of not lying, but it's the active activity of always being truthful and honest and encouraging others to have a truthful and honest understanding of the nature of reality, of not allowing yourself to be lulled by the lies that samsara presents us and that our deluded minds present or experience, right? Not to be overwhelmed by the kind of darkness of ignorance, but to always live a life that's truthful and is seeking truth. So even those simple vows, which I imagine most of us hold as lay people, as householder vows, can be incredibly profound, and they can shape everything we do during the day because we don't think of them as passive. We think of them as active opportunities to practice. So quickly, before I go into enunciation, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about the Bodhisattva vows, since I think many of us probably have those as well. There are 18 root Bodhisattva vows and 46 secondary Bodhisattva vows, so I won't talk about all of them. Just a few of them I think are useful to talk about. And I think they're useful because they're common sense. And why that's beneficial to my mind is the point of these vows, right, is to become a Buddha, to live the life of a Bodhisattva, which many times during our practice, especially during our study when we learn all these intricate details, can seem like it's very far away. But then you look at the very first Bodhisattva vow. The very first Bodhisattva vow says, I will abandon praising myself and belittling others, especially out of attachment and jealousy. That is just common sense, right? We can see the benefit of that, even if it's hard to do, and we live a life where we're used to kind of seeking out praise, and we live a life that's used to kind of putting others down. Even if that's our habit, it's very easy to understand why that's harmful. And so for me, I say, well, I'm already closer to Buddhahood because of that. Like, Buddhahood isn't something that's so far in the future that is impossible for me to reach, because what is the first Bodhisattva vow, the first vow that helps guide me towards Buddhahood, is something that is common sense. Not praising myself and belittling others. Not fostering minds of attachment or jealousy, right? So that shows me Buddhahood isn't impossible. At least for me, it's encouraging in that way. The Bodhisattva vows are very encouraging in that way for me, because they all are practical, and they all are things I can do in this life easily, and they parallel the actions of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva. So whenever I practice them actively, I am engaging in the same behavior as a Bodhisattva, or doing my best to. Buddhahood, the Mahayana path, isn't some impossible goal that I'll never reach and that I'm always going to be struggling for. Because look at how close it is. Look at what these vows are telling me to do, which is things I can do easily in this life. That's how close Buddhahood is. So these vows help me remind me of that. So the first one I think is, so powerful to think of. Abandon praising oneself, abandoning criticizing others, especially due to attachment and jealousy, or specifically due to attachment and jealousy. So what are we trying to abandon with that mind? What's the gaksha, as we say? The gaksha is self-cherishing, right? The gaksha is a mind that seeks and thinks myself more important than others and is chasing after the 8 worldly dharmas. The thing that we're eliminating is our grasping on to samsara and suffering as if it were happiness. In the same way, the second Bodhisattva vow is to abandon the act of not giving both spiritual and material gifts when you have the means to do so, especially not giving out of miserliness or out of a wish to have like an intellectual superiority to others. And again, this is common sense. It says, what resources do I have that I can use to help others? And if I have those, why would I keep them to myself? I think most of us would think of this naturally, right? We don't need this vow to understand how this is beneficial. But by having a vow, it shows us that we can practice in this way and live the life of bodhisattvas in this aspect of our life. When you have the means to benefit others through giving, whether it be spiritual, such as engaging in dharma conversation or discussion, or whether it be material, such as giving material gifts or things like that, when you have the means to do so and don't do it, why would you hold back from helping others in that way? And the only reason is because you cherish your own happiness more than others, right? Which we see leads to nothing but suffering. So that vow too, it's common sense. And so, when I think of the vows as being these common sense ways to live a meaningful life, it makes them infiltrate everything I do. I don't have to think about them as much. I can just practice them. And then even, the third one, not harboring a grudge when someone harms you, even after they've forgiven you or even after they've apologized. And this is especially due to a mind or motivation of anger, right? So holding on to the grievances you hold against others does nothing but poison your mind. It doesn't help you. It doesn't help them. So whether they apologize or not, but especially if they're apologizing, letting go of holding a grudge. Because a grudge is never going to benefit you, and it's not going to help any other sentient being either. That's a bodhisattva vow, to not hold a grudge. How easy is that, Well, it's not easy. That's the problem, right? This is samsara. It's difficult. Our conditioning and our habits are to hold grudges, to not forget. But it's easy to understand, and it's easy to see how holding a grudge does nothing to harm another sentient being. It does nothing to affect other sentient beings. It only affects us, and it only harms our mind. So it's easy to see that when we analyze it. And so the vow itself is pretty common. It's common sense. And the actions of a Buddha are common sense in that way. And I can practice them easily. When I say, what's the purpose of not holding a grudge? Well, it's to recognize that all sentient beings are suffering, that all sentient beings want to be free from suffering. And when they engage in harmful activities or harmful actions toward me, it is because they misunderstand the nature of reality. They misunderstand what will bring about happiness. They think that their harmful actions will bring them happiness, and they think it will cause them to avoid suffering. And in fact, it's the exact opposite, right? And so by not holding a grudge, I bring that to mind and I realize that other sentient beings are simply suffering and they're acting out of suffering. And so how can I be upset with someone who's suffering and whose actions come from a place of suffering? You know, I should be upset with suffering. I should be upset with some sorrow, not with this other person who's suffering. And so the vow of not holding a grudge even after someone apologizes is to recognize that other sentient beings are doing the best they can to have happiness and to avoid suffering. And most sentient beings are confused about what that means, and they're going about it in the wrong ways. And so instead of continuing down the wrong paths myself, I'll recognize that since they're acting out of suffering, there's no reason for me to develop anger or enmity towards them. And instead, I will develop compassion because I realize that they're suffering. And all they want is to not be suffering. And so compassion grows in place of holding a grudge. And that's something I can practice all the time, especially when other people harm me in some way, intentionally or unintentionally. I was going to go through some of the other vows, but we're short on time. I want to talk about renunciation. So I won't go over most of the others. I will say two important ones that I think to think about are, we have a vow not to criticize any of the Hinayana teachings, so any of the other Buddhist schools. And that's the vow. But in truth is, we're taught not to criticize any legitimate or valid spiritual practices that people are trying to use to become better people. So that's the kind of broad or elaborate way of understanding it. Specifically, we say all the teachings of the Buddha are valid teachings. And so he taught the Hinayana paths because there are some sentient beings who needed those teachings, that in order to develop their minds, they needed that level of teaching. And the Mahayana teachings, and especially the Tantric teachings, weren't appropriate for them at that time. So all the teachings of the Buddha are valid, and they all guide sentient beings towards liberation from suffering and Buddhahood, but they do it in different ways. So all of them are valid. So to criticize the Hinayana teachings and say, well, I'm a Mahayana practitioner, those teachings obviously are not true, is incorrect. And it's a negative action. And the reason we take a vow not to do that is to recognize that in an active way, that people are seeking to become better beings, to be better human beings, to have good hearts. And so even though we can be honest and say, well, I don't agree with this method, or I don't agree with this philosophical point of view, which is part of the study of the Dharma, right? We distinguish between the Hinayana philosophies and the Mahayana philosophies, what their understanding of selflessness is, what our understanding of selflessness is. We understand those distinctions, and we say one of them is a more refined understanding of the Buddha's ultimate thought. So that's not criticizing, though. That's just recognizing a distinction. Criticizing is saying there's no point to these practices. They're useless. They're not helpful. And the same goes when we look at other people practicing different religious traditions, but we see them having great benefit in their lives. We see them being more open-hearted, and more beneficial to others. And we see that their spiritual practice, even though we don't think it'll lead ultimately to Buddhahood, is still making them better people in this life. It's still helping them turn away from causing suffering. And so in that way, it's a beneficial practice. And so why would we ever criticize a beneficial practice? If we want our minds to be always rejoicing in virtue, then we should never be criticizing things that are bringing benefit. Even if it's temporary benefit, even if it's worldly benefit, even if it doesn't lead to perfect, complete Buddhahood in this life, it's still working on their minds or their hearts, trying to become better people. So that's something I think about a lot, because especially when you study intensively, you're studying how all the other views are wrong, right? That's part of study, because you want to understand the ultimate view of the Buddha, and you want to understand the ultimate positions that he put forth so you can practice them. And so to do that, especially, we study the other Buddhist tenet systems and the non-Buddhist Indian systems and see where their weaknesses lie and how they're incorrect and how the ultimate view of the Buddha, as understood through the Prasangika Madhyamaka philosophical position, corrects those misunderstandings of the teachings. So that's, one of the main things you do when you study intensively. But you can do that without criticizing those other teachings and without saying those teachings are worthless, recognizing that there's benefit to them, recognizing that in this world of samsara, people are doing the best they can. So anything they can do to improve their minds is huge. Even if it's just someone who tries to meditate on mindfulness every day for 15 minutes and they don't think of themselves as Buddhist, or maybe they call themselves Buddhist, but that's the limit of their practice, is engaging in mindfulness practice every day for a few minutes. Even if that's it, that's the limit of their practice. What an incredible practice. Think of how many sentient beings in this world, never mind sentient beings, how many humans don't take the time every day to look at their own minds, to try to have a spiritual course of development. Countless human beings don't put any effort into leading a spiritual life, into trying to make themselves a better person. So even the smallest activity, even activity that will not lead to Buddhahood in this life, is something we should rejoice in. And so when we say we have a vow to abandon any criticism or belittling of the Hinayana teachings, the active way to understand that is to encourage other people's spiritual development, encourage other people's good qualities in a worldly sense or a spiritual sense. Compliment others on what they do that is beneficial. Rejoice in others' good qualities. That's the active way to practice that vow. Sometimes, especially those of us who come to Buddhism later in life and we convert to Buddhism, our first instinct is to do everything we can to abandon whatever religious tradition we came from, because for most of us that come to Buddhism, that original tradition wasn't beneficial to our minds, right? And it didn't lead us towards happiness. At least that's my experience with many convert Buddhists. And so our instinct is to say that, well, now I've discovered Buddhism, this is making my life more meaningful. Obviously, that tradition is harmful or not beneficial, and we develop some level of judgment towards others who practice that. And now it's true, right, that due to the political nature of some religious traditions, they encourage unhealthy or harmful behavior. So I'm not saying we should accept that, like discrimination and other kind of harmful, never mind the Crusades and other things like this, and forcible conversion, things like that. Not talking about those which are clearly negative, but just your general practitioner is trying to be a better person, whether they think that means becoming closer to God or whatever it may be. And so that is something we can rejoice in, that they're trying to make themselves a better person in this life, even if we don't think that their path will lead to ultimate happiness. And so my instinct, especially when I first started studying Buddhism and took refuge, was to dismiss all other religious traditions as being harmful. Yet, I know at least some of the people I've met in my life who are some of the most profound, spiritually advanced practitioners were not Buddhists. A very good friend of mine who just passed away last month from pancreatic cancer was a bishop in the Celtic Orthodox Church. And I met him because he was teaching theological French at my grad school. And I didn't study with him, but my friend did. And he said, you need to meet this guy, because he always wears like the full black cassock with a big cross on it. And he looks like a very stereotypical Christian monk with like a big white beard down to here and then bald on top with just a little tonsure in the back. And I met him, and he lived near the Buddhist center that I attended. And I realized this person is one of the closest beings to a bodhisattva I've met in my life, outside of my teachers. Yet he didn't practice Buddhism. Though he did in his own way, but not explicitly. He was following his own tradition. So when we think of active ways, the vow of not belittling the Hinayana, the active way is to celebrate other people's quest to become better people, to complement their good qualities. And so We can think of all the vows this way. There's this passive thing of what we're trying to abandon, but there's the active component of saying, what's the opposite of that thing? If I know I'm trying to abandon pride, then what's the opposite of that? And how can I practice the opposite of that? By complimenting others, by allowing myself to serve others, to putting myself below others in that way. So any vows you take, you have the passive aspect, but more important in our everyday life is the active aspect, which is only understood once you understand what's the point of the vow, what is the vow trying to eliminate, what harmful behavior is the vow trying to eliminate, and where is the vow leading us? How is the vow guiding us towards happiness and away from suffering? Even if it doesn't seem that way. Before I ordained, I brewed my own beer for maybe a decade or so, and I really enjoyed specialty and craft beer. It was a big source of joy in my life. And I drank probably every single day, only one beer usually. I didn't like getting drunk, and I didn't like losing my senses, but I just enjoyed the process of brewing beer and the science behind it and the nerdiness behind it. And it was a great joy in my life. And I kind of justified it because the Dalai Lama especially said, as Westerners, maybe just try to reduce your alcohol intake. So even though I had vows, the lay person vows, I said, okay, I'm never becoming intoxicated. I'm very, very cautious like this. Then when I became a monk, obviously you had to give that up entirely. And my aspiration to become a monk made it easy to do. But at the same time, you say like, do I really have to? Like I could have one beer and it wouldn't affect my mind, right? I know I could. I've done it many, many times. So is it really that important? Or am I just cutting myself off from a sense of joy that I used to enjoy or that I used to experience? And so you think about it and you think, well, what kind of joy did I really get from that activity? Was it real joy, or was it just like this temporary happiness, indulging my kind of my geekiness and my nerdiness, right? And then, if you meet anyone who are like beer snobs, it actually creates this very strong sense of ego, right? That I know more about this topic than you. I've done a deep dive into it. So there wasn't really any joy there. There wasn't real happiness there. And so by abandoning it, even though it was difficult, and even though I had to go through a process of saying, this is something I'm abandoning kind of against my will, I realize there's only benefit from abandoning it. That's why the Buddha taught us that way. That's why the Buddha gave these vows. The Buddha would never give vows that harm us. He only gives vows that lead us to liberation, that lead us out of samsara. And so I realize I've talked longer than I thought. I want to just briefly mention about renunciation and the 8 worldly dharmas, very briefly, and then we'll have times for question and answers. But the reason I want to bring them up is because I see all the vows as leading towards renunciation. Well, most of the vows. I suppose, there's a Bodhisattva vow to never teach emptiness to students who are unfit or at an inappropriate time. So that may not be quite leading towards renunciation. But most of the vows are kind of circling around this idea of renunciation. So what is renunciation? Renunciation is not giving up things we like. It is not giving up happiness. Renunciation is giving up samsara. It's developing a revulsion towards samsara, towards suffering. That's renunciation. It's giving up the mind that clings to the pleasures of samsara as if they were real happiness. That's what we need to renounce. And the way we renounce it is by committing ourselves to practicing a path of virtue and a path that is dedicated to helping others. A path that is constantly seeking out our own self-cherishing mind and doing everything we can to undermine that self-cherishing mind, to eradicate it. There's the story, whenever you study renunciation, you hear the story of Dramtompa. So Dramtompa was one of the 3 heart disciples of Atisha, when Atisha came to Tibet and taught. And Dramtompa was also his translator. And Dramtompa actually was a layperson. He had a family, yet he still achieved great realization in this life. So he's often held up as one of the examples that you do not have to be ordained to achieve great levels of realization. But one day he was walking towards a monastery, or through one of these monasteries that he had helped found, and he saw an old monk who was sitting outside the monastery reciting sutras or reciting sacred texts. And he said to the monk, he said, "Oh, how wonderful that you're reciting those texts. But wouldn't it be better if you practiced Dharma?" So the monk was very confused. And he said, "What does he mean? I thought I was practicing Dharma." And so then he said, "Well, he must mean that I should do more meditation." And so he started doing more meditation. And the next day, Gyalten came by and he saw him and he said, "Oh, that's so wonderful that you're meditating. I rejoice. Wouldn't it be better if you practiced Dharma?" So at this point, the monk's getting really confused. And he says, "I thought I was, what is he talking about? I thought I was practicing Dharma." Okay, he must mean that I should do more circumambulations around stupas. So he starts doing that. And Gyalten sees him the next day as he's doing these circumambulations. And he says, "Oh, it's so great that you're doing circumambulations. I rejoice. Wouldn't it be better to practice Dharma?" So at this point, the monk kind of loses it. And he says, "I thought I was practicing Dharma. What do you mean?" And Gyalten says, "You must renounce this life. That is what it means to practice Dharma." So renouncing this life doesn't mean giving up pleasure. It means giving up clinging to pleasure. And it means even when you're doing activities that on the outside look virtuous, if they aren't empowered by the right motivation, then they're not Dharma activities. They're not virtuous activities. So we renounce the pleasures of samsara, and instead of seeking all of samsara's perfections, we seek a mind to be free from that suffering. We seek a mind that abandons self-cherishing. And so I'll just mention very briefly the 8 worldly dharmas, since I have brought them up a few times in this class and last week as well. So the 8 worldly dharmas are like the commanders or the generals of the army of self-cherishing. So when we're trying to root out our self-cherishing mind, we can search for these 8 worldly dharmas and see how they infiltrate our activities. And so the 8 worldly dharmas are 4 pairs. They are pairs of things that we are attached to and seeking out, and then things that we are trying to avoid. So we are constantly seeking out our own pleasure and trying to avoid discomfort. We're constantly seeking out our own profit or gain, and we're trying to avoid loss. We're constantly seeking out praise or compliments, and we're trying to avoid criticism. And we're constantly seeking out fame or popularity, and we're trying to avoid infamy or a bad reputation. So these 8 thoughts, 4 things that we're trying to, that we're attached to, and 4 things that we're trying to avoid, when any of those 8 serve as the motivation for our activities, even if the activity itself on the outside looks like a Dharma activity, then it's actually an act of the self-cherishing mind. Anything we do that's motivated by one of those 8 is really just our self-cherishing mind. And it might use the external veneer of Dharma practice. But if I am only giving a Dharma teaching because I want people to know what a great Dharma scholar I am and to become a very popular teacher, then that's not a Dharma practice. That's a practice for my self-cherishing mind, for my ego, right? That only brings me more suffering. It doesn't bring me happiness. So even though the activity may seem like a virtuous activity from the outside, if it's empowered by one of the 8 worldly minds, or by a mind seeking one of the 8 worldly dharmas, then it is digging itself deeper into samsara. And so if you think of the different vows that we have, especially the Bodhisattva vows, but also the Pratimoksha vows, we can see that those are trying to cut off any thought of following an 8 worldly dharma. And so they're leading us to abandon the mind of self-cherishing, to replace it by our active practice of cherishing others, and by doing so, develop a mind of renunciation that has this revulsion towards the suffering of samsara, that isn't attracted to all of the bright, shiny pleasures that samsara has to offer, and instead is seeking out freedom from all suffering and the permanent bliss and happiness of Buddhahood for ourselves and for all sentient beings. And so the vows, whatever level of vows we may take, they are guiding us towards that happiness and bliss of Buddhahood. They are guiding us away from suffering. They're showing us the passive activities of what we need to abandon. And by understanding that, we see the active processes of what we need to adopt and how we can live a life following the vows to be a life that's more beneficial to ourselves and others. So we need to study the vows. We need to become familiar with them so we understand them. We have to understand what their purpose is, why they were given, what they're trying to eliminate. And then we meditate on them so we become familiar with them and so they become effortless. Right? And in the same time, we can review whatever actions we do during this day and see if they were motivated by one of the 8 worldly dharmas or not. And then during our analytical practice, we can see how the vows help us prevent self-cherishing minds and help encourage renunciation. And by doing this analytical work and this meditative work, then throughout the day, it becomes our natural inclination to engage in the virtuous activities that the vows promote and encourage. And so once we become confident that what these vows are actually doing is leading us towards liberation, then the practice of the vows becomes joyful. And that's the point of this practice, is to experience joy. So the vows are never a burden, but instead a great opportunity to experience joy and bliss. That's the purpose of the vows. And we can only get there through study and analysis, meditation, and then practicing. Okay, maybe that's a good place to end. I've gone a little long, but I think we still have some time for a few questions if there are any. So I'm happy to take them.
If you have any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself. Venerable, I'd like to say it is a little bit hard though. In your first class on karma, in the class on karma, you talked about not seeing karma as good or bad, but yet the words we use are negative and positive karma, right? You talk about saying we don't criticize other forms of Buddhism, but there's the great scope and the lesser scope. There's the person who's seeking Buddhahood for himself, only himself, and there's a person who seeks Buddhahood for the sake of others. And in the end, you're right, both of those things get us to the same place. But a lot of times, just the words we choose to use, whether we like it or not, have positive or negative connotations in our own culture.
Yeah, and that's true. That's true also even in in Tibetan culture as well. There's superimpositions to the words that we have to recognize. Those come from our minds, though, right? And we have to recognize that those superimpositions are not that they are delusions that we project onto it. So even in contemporary Buddhist circles, they don't like the term Hinayana, right, or lesser vehicle, because they feel it's derogatory. And so you usually talk about Theravadan, but depending on what you're talking about, that could be inaccurate, right? Because the Theravada school is only one of 18 historical schools that fall into the category of Hinayana. And they're the only one that exists now. So all contemporary practitioners of the so-called Hinayana are going to be Theravada practitioners. But if I'm talking from a historical point of view, or if I'm talking about the philosophies that those schools teach, it'd be more accurate to talk about the Hinayana. And so the Tibetans say the word Hinayana, lesser vehicle, is because their goal is smaller than the Mahayana, the greater vehicle. It has nothing to do with the quality or the nature of the practitioners, but it says that the goal of freeing all sentient beings from suffering is a larger goal than the goal of freeing oneself from suffering. And because of that, that's the distinction between lesser and smaller, or lesser and greater. Yet it's true that when I use that language, it can become due to our contemporary sensibilities, it can be off-putting to people. So I have to be aware of that. And if I'm in a Dharma discourse like this, I take the time to explain it. And it's not just me. You see that explanation in the text as well. So it's clear that this isn't a new phenomena, that people are or projecting things onto the terms. We just have to be honest with ourselves, And so when I'm studying the philosophical systems of the other schools, and I'm saying this is an inaccurate representation of reality, and it doesn't lead to a realization of emptiness. And if you don't have a realization of emptiness, you can't actually eliminate all the delusions and their seeds from your continuum, right? I can understand that, and then therefore try to align my practice with what I believe to be the correct philosophical understanding. But I have to be able to do that without looking down upon people that practice that other way, and realize that in the case of the Buddhist tenets, they were taught because that is what those students needed. So the idea of smaller or lesser or middling scope, small scope, great scope, you're right that the language can create divisiveness, but it's our responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen. And so when we have doubts in our own minds about how the language is working and what the implications may be, then it's our responsibility to study more and try to analyze where it comes from to understand the intention, and then to, if we still have doubts, ask other teachers or Dharma practitioners who can maybe help alleviate those doubts. And then when we discuss the Dharma, do our best to be clear about why we use the language we use and to make sure that we don't give any false impressions. But you're right. It is the language itself it comes with burdens, so we have to be conscious of that.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't think of a positive or negative terminal on a battery as good or bad. I think of them as positive or negative. But typically, when I think of positive and negative, I think positive is a really good thing and negative is a bad thing. So, thank you.
Yeah. I think, William.
Yes. I think all the vows that you mentioned were proscriptive. And you said there were a number that were prescriptive. Can you provide a couple of examples?
Yeah. So the prescriptive vows are tantric vows. So when you take tantric vows, there are 19 what are called samaya. They're types of vows, though. So samaya is a commitments. And then there are 14 root tantric vows, and then additional secondary vows. But so the 19 commitments are types of vows, and those are like actively taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha every day, or actively practicing generosity, practicing the generosity of love and the generosity of protection. So if we look at the 19 samayas, they're called, or the commitments that come with the tantric vows, then those are all prescriptive, saying these are things that you have to be doing every day. So those are the most common ones. For lay people, I think those would be the only ones. All of the Bodhisattva vows, both the 18 primary and the 46 secondary, are all proscriptive. And the pratimoksha vows for lay people are all proscriptive. Of the 253 vows that I hold as a fully ordained monk, I think a few of them may be prescriptive, but not many. Almost all of them are proscriptive. It's only the tantric vows really that are prescriptive.
So I wonder if, at least for me, it seems like there's value in not only understanding, the vows that you've covered so far, but from the proscriptive side, but also thinking what would be that same vow if it were prescriptive? What would you do from the opposite? Which puts it in a very positive framework. And so instead of, just don't kill somebody, what can you do prescriptively, to love and show compassion?
Well, exactly. That's what I was hopefully trying to emphasize, is that when you have these proscriptive vows, they seem passive, but it's our responsibility to then turn them into these active processes where we say, what is the opposite of this vow? How can we practice the opposite of it? So if the vow of not killing is to prevent harm to other beings, then simply not harming others is one level of the vow. But if we make it prescriptive or active, then we also engage in activities to promote the health and well-being, both physical and emotional, of other sentient beings. So I think you're right, that if we only think of the vows themselves are worded in proscriptive ways, and they're trying to encourage us to abandon negative behavior, so we stay on the path towards liberation. But the more appropriate way to understand them is, not only are we abandoning negative behavior, but it's encouraging the opposite virtuous behavior as well. So I think you're right. That's a healthy way to engage in the vows, and that's the easiest way to practice them in our everyday lives. Simply not killing throughout the day and having a mind that says, I'm not going to kill, that's a powerful virtuous activity, but it can become more virtuous if we say the real point of this vow is to bring about the health and well-being of other sentient beings. So what can I do to engage in that kind of behavior? So that's why we need to study the vows to understand what are the vows trying to eliminate, like what negative action is the actual focus of the vow, not just the physical activity, but the mental activity that precedes that we're trying to eliminate. And then by understanding that, we can see, well, what's its opposite and how can I try to implement that in my everyday life? But you're right. Yeah.
Right. It seems like your analogy to bowling, the gates are there to keep you out of the gutter. So that's the proscriptive side of it. But the prescriptive would be, okay, here's how you get your ball towards the center lane and you can get a strike. So,
Yeah. When I was thinking about this earlier, I used that metaphor in this class I taught in Bodh Gaya, and it didn't go over that well because most people weren't Americans. They had no idea what I was talking about. But I've been thinking about it since then, and it is kind of only half of a metaphor, because you're right. It only shows the proscriptive part. And I've been trying to think about ways to understand the prescriptive aspect of it. So you're right. It's not just the preventing you from going in the gutter, but it's the instruction that says this is the technique to, you don't just go straight down. You have to try to curve the ball and hit it in this such and such a way. So I don't know. I haven't quite extended the metaphor yet. I'm trying to, though. At least you all know what bowling is, so that makes it a little easier. Maybe you can help me. When all the students are from other countries that have no idea what I'm talking about, it makes it difficult.
Barbara?
Venerable,
Yeah.
in last week's teaching, you mentioned the book 37 Practices of a Bodhisattva, and I want to look that up, and there were a couple of them. So I want to make sure I get the one that you recommended. Who authored that?
Oh, so the root text, 37 Practices of a Bodhisattva, is by Gyalten Tokme Zampo, who was a 12th, 13th century Tibetan. And there are a number of commentaries on it that are beneficial.
And would you say the name one more time?
Yeah. So this is a great one. So his name is Tokme Zampo, sometimes called Gyalten Tokme Zampo.
Okay.
And he's, like I said, he's born in the 12th century and he lived through the 13th century. This is a great one. It's called Illuminating the 37 Practices of a Bodhisattva.
Okay.
And it's by Shiki Drakpa, and it's translated by Heidi Koppel. This is a really nice one. It goes through all of them, but there are quite a few. I haven't read all of them. All the ones I have read. There's one by Geshe Sonam, and Ruth Sonam translated it. That one's also really nice. So all the ones I've read are nice. Some of them are more detailed than others, and some focus on, there are 37 verses, so some focus on different ones with stronger emphasis than others. So I've never read any that I thought were not beneficial, but I haven't read all of them. So put it that way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anything else this evening? I've kept you a little long. I apologize. Okay. So if there are no other questions for this evening, let's just take a moment to make our practice virtuous in the 3 times. It was virtuous in the beginning because we set a strong motivation. And it was virtuous in the middle because we engaged in a Dharma discourse and conversation. And hopefully it'll be virtuous at the end by dedicating our virtue. So we recognize that our practice today has generated some merit, some virtue. And instead of keeping that for ourselves alone, we dedicate that merit that positive merit may ripen on all sentient beings, that they might be free from all suffering, that they might quickly and more quickly achieve the state of perfect, complete Buddhahood, and that we ourselves might achieve Buddhahood quickly so that we might be of maximum benefit to all sentient beings to lead them out of all the sufferings of samsara. Through this virtue may I swiftly, having gained Guru Buddha's state, place each and every sentient being without exception in that state. Precious Supreme Bodhi Mind, may it where unborn arise, and where born never decline, but increase forevermore. Thank you so much for spending your evening with me today. I appreciate all of you, your time, and your practice. Hope you have a good evening, and I look forward to joining you again next week.